Good day everyone and welcome to another video in Teaching English in the Elementary Grades. Previously, in Teaching English in the Elementary Grades, we discussed about folklore and its different types. But today's focus topic is all about modern fantasy. At the end of the lesson, the students should be able to describe what modern fantasy is and demonstrate positive disposition and enjoyment of modern fantasy related to use with young children. These are the objectives that we need to accomplish at the end of our lesson. To formally begin our discussion, let us define first what modern fantasy is. Contemporary fantasy, otherwise known as modern fantasy, is a subgenre of fantasy set in the present day, or more accurately, the time period of the maker. It is perhaps most popular for its subgenre, which is the urban fantasy. Moreover, modern fantasy has story elements that violate the natural, physical laws of our known world. Hence, it has known authors. Some miraculous elements found in modern fantasy are talking animals, imaginary worlds, fanciful characters, magical beings, and so on. Some types of modern fantasy include the following, such as toys and objects imbued with life, tiny humans, peculiar characters and situations, imaginary worlds, magical powers, supernatural tales, time warp fantasy, and high fantasy. Sharing with you how to locate children's books. E stands for Easy Reader and Picture Books, Fiction for elementary students, NF for nonfiction books intended for elementary students, J for juvenile or chapter books for upper elementary students, YA for young adult fiction books intended for middle and high school students, and last but not the least, YANF, young adult nonfiction books for middle and high school students. Maybe you are thinking of how are science fiction and fantasy distinct? What's the difference between the two? We'll be tackling science fiction versus fantasy. Science fiction often takes place in a dystopian society sometime in the future and contains elements of advanced technology, while a fantasy story, on the other hand, is usually set in the fantasy realm and includes mythical creatures and supernatural powers. Though the similarities between these two genres are readily apparent, there are more similarities and crossovers between the two genres than first meets the eye. What are the elements of the science fiction genre? First, it has something to do with science. As its name implies, science fiction uses elements of science. Science fiction is a broad genre that encompasses many different styles and subgenres. The way that science is incorporated can vary greatly from one science fiction story to another. Elements of science often inform the visual aesthetic or science fiction. The use of science as well takes many different shapes in the more realistic subgenre of hard science fiction, but it is almost always present in some way, shape, or form. Another element of science fiction genre is technology. Science fiction often explores advanced technologies like time travel and space travel. Stories often unfold on other planets or onboard futuristic spaceships. Even when sci-fi stories take place in recognizable real-world settings, the world building often layers in new technologies that pose obstacles and existential questions for the characters and society at large. The last characteristic or element of the science fiction genre is a dystopian. It has a dystopian setting. Sci-fi writers generally set their stories in dystopian societies. Science fiction often explores dystopian themes in a far-flung worlds that ultimately bear striking similarities to the philosophical questions and moral quandaries that we deal with in the real world. The point is often to raise the question of how different the sci-fi world is from our own. We're done discussing the different elements of science fiction. Now let's have naman this time, what are the elements of the fantasy genre? First, mythical creatures. A typical fantasy world is often populated by mythical creatures that can't be found in the real world. The fantasy genre is sometimes referred to as the first narrative style. Humans have been incorporating mythical creatures and other elements of fantasy into their stories for millennia. The genre has obviously changed and developed, and fantasy books now account for some of the most popular and successful books on the market. Like for example, um, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Harry Potter, etc. In addition, about mythical creatures as one of the elements of the fantasy genre, supernatural creatures and other fantastical elements are often understood to be normal, everyday parts of the world of the story. The second element is about having supernatural powers. Fantasy characters oftentimes possess magical or supernatural powers with no scientific or rational explanation. While they are often capable of accomplishing similar feats as characters in sci-fi, the explanation for these powers is generally magical or supernatural rather than technological. The last element is about having robust world building. One of the most impressive aspects of many fantasy novels is the complex histories, languages, and family trees that their authors chart out. Fantasy writers go to great lengths to construct an entire new world with a detailed history and, at the same time, complex culture. Now, let's have the two differences between science fiction and fantasy. As should be obviously by now, science fiction and fantasy overlap quite a bit. There are 7 subgenres like science fantasy that explicitly blend the two. The first one is plausibility. A science fiction story generally extrapolates elements of the modern world and attempts to predict how they could possibly develop. Fantasy, on the other hand, uses supernatural elements that have no link to our contemporary world. A useful way of thinking about the differences between the genres is that the fantasy genre traffics in the impossible, whereas science fiction can be thought of as speculative fiction that draws its internal logic from the real world. Number 2, setting. Generally speaking, science fiction stories often take place in a dystopian, hyper-technological future. Fantasy stories are traditionally set in worlds populated by mythical creatures and supernatural events. Moreover, the world itself can look quite similar to our own, but it has fantastical elements. Lastly, for this lesson, how they are used appropriately with young children. We have here two explanations. The first one is fantasy fiction it inspires preschoolers to learn new words or new vocabularies. The second one is fantasy play might help preschoolers develop their executive functions, like it has something to do with the mental abilities that allow learners to concentrate, make appropriate plans, keep their emotional impulses under control. So those are the appropriate usages or significance of modern fantasy for our young children. That sums up our lesson for this morning. May you please give your overall reaction regarding our lesson. Kindly explain it thoroughly. Use the comment section below. Thank you so much for listening and see you next time here at Learn with Teacher Farah. Bye-bye.